All right, well, I guess we're rolling. So,
Okay,
Bob,
great.
thanks for coming in again. It's our third iteration. We're here to talk about the Vietnam War, um, especially the lessons learned and the highlights that you point out in your book, How to Stop Wars and Save the World. Um, in terms of getting started, in some ways, I feel like we should probably address what's been happening this week
Yeah,
before we really jump into.
just to put a date on it, it's 9/11/25, 24th anniversary of the World Trade Center attack, and then Charlie Kirk got assassinated yesterday.
Yeah.
It's making things feel like they felt for me as a teenager in the 1960s when Martin Luther King was assassinated and Bobby Kennedy and Senior. And we're back in those times. So it is very timely to talk about what needs to happen.
What are we going to talk about?
Film,
business, music, art,
Technology.
Podcasting from Jacksonville, North Carolina, it's Backstage at TENCROW Studios.
The whole point of this book is to convince people to learn more about past wars so that they can choose better leaders, because they can see what leaders did in past wars. And if we have better leaders, at least over time, and a more educated voter pool who know what's important in a leader and what they should look for and what they should avoid when they hear leaders doing or saying things that are counterproductive, they should recognize that. But I won't tell them what, I'll tell them the stories and they can figure it out for themselves, what is admirable, what's not admirable.
Yeah.
And just move forward. That's all we ever can do in America. American history is full of bloody incidents, it's full of conflict, and it's not surprising when you think of America being in 1492 a completely undiscovered country as far as Europe was concerned, and here it was filled with Native Americans. And basically the Native Americans in the process of 500 years were virtually destroyed, just remnants of their culture and people, with disease and with the settlers in America pushing forward to settle the whole continent. And also you have Mexico and you have Canada. So you have a tremendous amount of places where conflict could arise. And so America has kind of been built on conflict. You could argue the world has been built on conflict, but this is all about trying to solve the conflicts the best way possible. Because the conclusion I came to writing this book was that both sides in the three American wars we discussed in this book, both sides ended up worse than if they had settled.
Yeah.
And going forward, we want to try and avoid the worst outcome for everyone if we can. Going to Vietnam, I really didn't have a good feeling about it. I remember hearing on the news when I was a teenager, and I was from a conservative background, and at that time it was really conservative. You'd hear a lot of people say, America, love it or leave it, or my country, right or wrong. Which I never liked that, my country right or wrong. You know, that's such extreme patriotism. It says, oh, my country does something that's terrible, I should support it anyway. And so here we are. Let's talk about how we got into Vietnam, how it started, and we have to go back all the way to 1883 when the French colonized Vietnam. In the 1800s, there was colonization going on all over the world. All the powerful countries were doing it. France, Britain, we were too, the United States was. Yeah. And it was a time of lots of conflicts. But the Vietnamese people themselves had been conquered on and off for 1,000 years by the Chinese, who lived next door. And when the Chinese weren't running things, there were a series of warlords in Vietnam who were running things. But the French came in, again, after the Industrial Revolution, superior technology, and they invaded in 1883, and they basically took Vietnam as their colony and exploited it like a colony. So they take the resources, they put over their settlers, not to displace Vietnamese, but to control what was going on and get the wealth of the country funneled into France and making France very wealthy and powerful. So the Vietnamese people had always been oppressed since 1883 anyway,
Right.
as a country. And in 1941, World War II started, and guess what? It wasn't long before the Germans came into France and conquered France. So now France has its colony in Vietnam. What do? Well, a lot of the people went home to go fight in France or to fight in other European countries to try and regain France, which ultimately happened in 1945. So the United States had been, before World War II, had been isolationist. They really wanted to stay out of everybody's fights, except their own. I put it that way. We had annexed Hawaii in 1898, became an American territory, now a state. But basically, we just took it from the Hawaiian people because we could. So in 1945, World War II ends, and the question is, well, what happens with Vietnam now? The Japanese had taken control of Vietnam, and again, they ran it brutally at that time. The Japanese thought of themselves as the chosen people, and they didn't care what they did to other people. So France decided it wanted to go back and regain its colony, and it wanted to become a world power again. So it wanted to help its economy by getting all the Vietnamese natural resources and so forth. So the British said, no, you're foolish to do this because the world has changed. We can't hold on to our colonies, and we recognize it. So we're letting go India. We're letting go some of the African colonies. We can't hang on to them. There's no way to do it. And Vietnam clearly had a big segment of its population that wanted freedom finally after the French in 1883. And Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader who had come out of Vietnam, and he had circulated around the world in the early 1900s. He went all over. He was the ambassador for a free Vietnam. And he came to believe during his travels that Vietnam would be much better under communism. That communism seemed like a fairer system. And remember, communism was relatively new as far as being a powerful political entity. It was only in 1917 that the first country went communist, which was Russia. And so you're talking about 1945, that's only 30 years before. And after 1945, China became communist in 1949, 1950. So you had two major countries become communist. And Ho Chi Minh felt that it would be a fairer system. Communism was supposed to help the farmers and the workers and take it away from the evil capitalists who were doing colonialism. So Ho Chi Minh had a lot of political power in Vietnam. And the Americans were in a quandary because France said they wanted help. And they wanted help in Europe. And we wanted France to help in Europe. We wanted to rebuild Europe. We just had this huge war, and who knew what would happen in Europe going forward. So we wanted to support France. And so we ended up supporting France going back to Vietnam, which is sort of strange because here we are, the land of the free, and now we're saying to the French, yeah, go back and colonize. But again, they were our friends, and everybody was afraid of communism. That was the big problem. Communism, the government would take all the land, all the property, would run everything, and it was kind of the opposite of capitalism. The communist governments would decide everything. Trade would be different. It was just a completely different system that threatened the capitalistic systems that had built America and modernized Europe. So it was a couple of philosophies that were diametrically opposed. And we decided, okay, in order to fight communism, we will help France. And also must be remembered that the Russians stole the secrets for the atomic bomb from Los Alamos. They had spies in Los Alamos, so that even though we had the atomic bomb in 1945 and nobody else had it, the Russians within 5 years had it and were building their own bombs. So not only was it another country that America was afraid of for having nuclear bombs, but it was a country whose economy was diametrically opposed to the American system, the capitalist system. So that's really what drove the decision-making to support France. It was, we've got to support our friends if we're going to survive in this world. And we developed, the Americans developed, we have to make the world safe for democracy. Now that's a pretty bold position to take. But America had come out of the Great Depression and isolationism to become the most powerful country in the world. And the Americans knew it at that time. We're the biggest dog right now. And that gave them that feeling of power. And that's where we started to get into trouble, is when you start thinking we can do whatever we want to get what we want, but you forget what the country was built on. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So anyway, we supported the French coming back, and it didn't go well for the French, because again, the Vietnamese were not pleased about this, and there was a much bigger communist underground political movement going on. Vietnam was all one country at that time. The North Vietnam was much poorer than South Vietnam, the geographical South. They were all one country at that time, but the North was rocky, it was hard, the people were poorer, they had to struggle more. The South had the Mekong River, they had easy farming, life was good, and even with the French had developed it in such a way that it was called the Paris of Asia. You know, Saigon was a great city. The French had made it into a great city, although their biggest mistake was they treated the Vietnamese like second-class citizens in their own country.
In their own country, yeah.
And that just doesn't fly. If you want to look at revolutions, that's a good way to get a revolution, is don't treat a certain section of the people like you treat the other sections. And something we should remember in America, that everybody's entitled to good treatment. So the French come back, and they're facing terrorism on an increasing level, and we're supporting them. And they start running out of money.
I got to
Okay,
make
I'm
one
sorry.
quick admin
Sure.
note. Try to avoid tapping on this.
Oh,
'cause
I'm sorry.
It's coming through the
the coffee's getting to me.
thing.
So
I totally understand.
So the French come back, but it's not going well. They're have all kinds of terrorism going on. The Vietnamese are fighting them underground. They do have sort of military in North Vietnam fighting, and there's battles going on, and they're running out of money. The French don't have money. Their economy was destroyed in World War II, and so they say to America, we need you to help fund this fight. And we start giving them money to fight against the Vietnamese communists. And by the time that the French pull out in 1958, I think it is, completely, we're paying 80% of the total expense of France to fight this war. Now, the reason the French got out is they had a horrific battle at Dien Bien Phu, where the communists snuck up on them. They didn't realize it was happening. They marshaled huge quantities of soldiers and artillery that they had gotten from China, and I guess some from Russia too. And they surrounded this encampment in North Vietnam that was the French encampment, and they just blew it apart. And the French lost huge numbers of men. There were also mercenaries that the French had there that they had paid to fight for them, and it was just a disaster for them. And that was the recognition by the French people, like, hey, what are we doing here? We can't beat these guys. So ultimately, they withdrew, and there was a peace accord in Geneva, and Vietnam was partitioned in half to North Vietnamese being communist and South Vietnam being capitalist. And you can imagine the disruption as the people in the North who were capitalists had to leave their property behind, take what they could take with them, and move into the South. And the same thing, people who wanted to be part of the communist movement had to move north. You can imagine this. It'd be a crazy time. And at the same time that this was going on in Vietnam, the United States, CIA, State Department were engaged in secret wars, in not full-blown wars, but by putting people in and trying to overthrow other governments. Eisenhower knew about this and approved it secretly, but publicly America's stance was, no, we're not interfering with any other country.
Right.
But we were. And even Eisenhower, who was a conservative and was a pretty square president, the threat of the nuclear bomb in the 50s, nuclear war, I think he felt like, well, maybe these guys in the State Department are right. Mostly it was the Dulles brothers who were the prime movers towards overthrowing several governments. In the book, it goes through this. And the Iranian government was one of them. I mean, this is one of the reasons we have problems with Iran today. And the thought was, well, we need to do what's good for America, and if it means doing these secret things, we're going to do them secretly, but we're not going to tell our people about it. And yet here it is a democracy, right? We're supposed to be able to know what's going on and to vote on these things. So it's partitioned over the protest of the Americans. And then the question is, okay, well, what happens now? The French are leaving. Does that just mean the communists are going to take over? Well, the Americans didn't want that to happen. So they said, we'll fund it 100%. And we took over the war. Now, if we took over the war and did it a smart way, so that it was communist versus capitalist, and we had influence, and South Vietnam was more capitalist-oriented anyway, because they had been with the French and they had a good economy and things like that compared to the North, that would have been fine. But what we did is we left the French people, the people that the French had been using, the South Vietnamese cooperators with the French, we left the same people in power. So we were perceived by the people of Vietnam as just completely replacing the French, whom they didn't like, and we were just going to be the next colonizing country. So that put us really behind the spot. The big problem is we kept funneling money. The main guy who was running South Vietnam at that time was Diem, and one of the reasons the French chose him and the Americans continued with him was that he was a Catholic. And yet that was a big minority religion in Vietnam. Most of them were Buddhists. But I think that the Americans felt like, oh, he's a Catholic, he's our guy. But he was awful. He ran his government in a way that oppressed anybody who wasn't on his side. So if you got arrested and you were a friend of Diem, you wouldn't go to jail, nothing bad would happen. But if you did a little thing wrong and you weren't really on his side, you might go to prison for years and years. And he had the hospitals, the police, the whole government was run on this sort of oppressive Diem regime. And he did what he wanted to do. And the Americans were like, keep it up. It's like we want to keep in control down here.
Yeah,
and so I think that the high-level Americans like Eisenhower and Kennedy didn't know just how badly things were working or not working in Vietnam as far as helping the people find democracy. It was just the opposite. Why, if you're a democratic country, why do you have to do all this bad stuff? They didn't know. The Vietnamese didn't know. They saw us as another, like the French. So it ends up that the Vietnam becomes America's puppet. That's how it's perceived, that it's really America doing all this. And the Vietnamese are not happy. When we first went in, we promised free elections. And the Vietnamese people were going to be able to vote in 1956 for democracy or whatever they wanted. But then the CIA found out that, no, most of the people want communism. So the CIA put a whole team in that basically fixed the election against the communist candidates, so that the election was like 98% or something like that in favor of the capitalist candidate. No election ever has 98%.
It's like the illusion of choice.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we complain about that happening in other countries like Russia today. We complain about that, but we were doing the same thing in Vietnam, behind the scenes, secretly. We weren't telling our people that we were doing this. Oh, they're having free elections. So, of course, things only get worse. That's the problem. And there's a disconnect between the leaders back home and the people who are on the ground in Vietnam. So they don't really have a good view of what's really happening there. They know they want to support capitalism, they want to fight communism, but nobody's looking at the details of how this is being done. and is recognizing that this is actually counterproductive. So we start pouring men, advisors, money in to try and help things go better, but it was really a political issue. The people really wanted communism, and what are we going to do when we put soldiers over there? What are they supposed to do? That's the problem. So we keep adding people, and John Kennedy, President Kennedy, I think he was pretty smart. He knew that it was a tough issue, and he didn't know quite what to do. Certainly, if you read the things that he said at the time, he wasn't, full speed ahead with this stuff. It was just a tricky situation, but it wasn't that big at that time. So it didn't have everybody's attention. And then he gets assassinated, okay? So that puts the whole country in shock in the United States. Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and the last thing anybody is thinking about is Vietnam at that point. That's right. Like, we'll put that on the back burner, whatever. We've got to make sure America doesn't have a revolution or, huge violence after this initial assassination. So that's what people were focused on. And it got bad. Under Lyndon Johnson, I think he's of all the American presidents, he's the one who's most responsible for what happened. He was a real political animal. And they engineered an incident with North Vietnam in 1964.
It's at the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah. And so we put a warship right off their coast, and they send their ship out. It sounds like a lot like the news today with drones flying over Poland or whatever. It's things going across borders. We're right on the edge of their border in North Vietnam.
I think when you look at it from a macro level, it's almost like the same recipe just being regurgitated.
Yeah.
In today's time.
People looking to assert their power, not necessarily thinking about what's right and what's wrong and what's effective. I mean, you can argue that morality doesn't mean as much as effectiveness. In other words, if you could have brought a peaceful, prosperous, secure government to Vietnam, there's an argument that can be made, well, even if you had to do some bad things to do it, you ended up with a good result. That's okay.
Yeah.
But not only were we going against our own ideals, but we were doing it ass backwards and wrong. And so that's doubly bad.
See, and I think that point you just made about effectiveness, traditionally that's been a big problem because, what is effective is defined differently depending on where you sit. And, I think when you're looking at stability and long-term longevity, effectiveness, to me, and maybe to most people, is that folks are able to live freely, peacefully, people get along, and that you take that type of morality and human condition into that's included in the equation. But even with the war on terror, it devolved into a point where measures of effectiveness were measured by the number of kinetic strikes that were conducted that day. And I wholeheartedly believe that that's not effective at all. You can't kill your way out of a conflict. If anything, if that's your measure of effectiveness, you're essentially doubling down on the problem. Because for every strike, you've created 10 more enemies, especially if those operations are, not fully, if the intel's inaccurate, or like in the Gulf of Tonkin type case, and there's many examples here recently too of the similar thing, but the incident is fabricated. So effectiveness, I don't know. I just think it's a huge, just the same way it's a mistake to pull consciousness out of science, to pull morality out of effectiveness, especially when it comes to conflict, is equally a gigantic mistake, because you're talking about people's lives.
Yeah, and if you're going for the greater good, that's the argument that the communists make. It's like, if we tear down capitalism, it will be for the greater good of all the people. We'll get rid of all the rich capitalists and everything will be fairer. That's the argument. But the trouble we know from watching the communist governments is that it's not true. The communist governments get ruled by oligarchies that control the whole government and that really oppress their own people, and they are ineffective in terms of how they run their economies, and they're just weaker than capitalist countries. Now, capitalist countries, I think you can also argue that they need controls. You don't want capitalism run wild. You need a police force to stop that too. But here we are in the Gulf of Tonkin. We send our ship, and then we fire on the North Vietnamese ship that comes out, and we tell our people, no, they fired on us first.
We got attacked.
Yeah, and we, and then they send out people to like pick up their survivors, and then we say, oh, they attacked again, and we start bombing the hell out of North Vietnam. And so that was incredibly counterproductive. One of the things that was holding the North Vietnamese back was fear of America. Really was. And so up until that Tonkin incident, yes, there was terrorism. Yes, they were putting pressure on, but they were doing it within limits. Once we lied to the world, and we did that, the people in North Vietnam, the leaders, say, well, if they're going to come after us anyway, we should go all out. So it escalated the war. So it was completely counterproductive, but it helped Lyndon Johnson get elected. This is the problem. He wanted to look strong. I think that's most everybody agrees that he
manufacture
did this.
A crisis.
Yeah. And this looking strong thing is, we see it today. We know that one of the reasons that Putin continues to send in drones and has increased, if anything, his efforts is he knows the world knows they're negotiating about a settlement, and he wants to appear strong to his people.
Sure.
And also he wants to show the Ukrainians, look, if you don't, this is what I can do to you. So that's the game he's playing. I think he ultimately does want to settle. He just wants to settle on the best terms. And he doesn't care if tens of thousands of lives get destroyed. And this is something that always bothers me about leaders of countries is they can waste human life without thinking twice about it. But I don't sit in their shoes, and I don't judge them on that. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson went ahead and did this, and it started a snowball rolling of nonsense that made things worse. Now Diem, they finally figured out, was so bad, and they said we've got to do something about this guy, and he was assassinated, even though he was obviously the chosen person of the United States. And the message that got sent was, well, the United States must have approved this, or it never would have happened. Yeah. So Diem leaves power. The people in Vietnam see this. They see, oh, he was America's boy, and now he's dead. I wonder who America's going to kill next. Does everybody really want to get on America's side when stuff like this happens? And I actually looked over last weekend. I looked over because I wanted to see this ad because I remembered seeing it, a political ad in 1964. I was 10 years old, and the kids in the schoolyard are arguing over who would become president. It was hotly contested between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater was a conservative Republican. And Johnson put this famous, the Johnson people put this famous Daisy ad on TV that had a little girl peeling petals off a daisy, and then it shifted to nuclear bombs going off. And it said, who do you want for president? And it was clearly trying to say that Barry Goldwater was the one who was going to drag us into a nuclear war or something like that. And it's worth looking at if anybody listening gets a chance to look at the Daisy ad. And the funny thing was, the ironic thing was, that Johnson was the one who was dragging us into war.
It's like the mirror effect.
Exactly. And if you hear the things that Barry Goldwater was saying, that there was nothing that was really controversial in it. He was for a strong America. He'd fit right in today with today's MAGA movement. He'd fit right in there. But you had a real choice, and Johnson was able to use emotion to persuade people that Goldwater was a risk and unstable, and he would bring our world to nuclear war, and without actually saying it, but just demonstrating,
just leveraging
commercial,
fear.
Right? So now what happens in Vietnam? You get the, I guess it was Diem before he got deposed. He went after the Buddhists who were having this big celebration. I think it was 1963. They were having a big Buddhist celebration, and it was the holiday, and the radio station was broadcasting it in Saigon. And Diem just didn't like it because it wasn't Catholic, and he just sent the troops down and shut it down. And there were a lot of religious people in monks and nuns and you name it in downtown Saigon, and they shot like eight women and
Jesus.
4 children, and yeah, it was. And then Diem wouldn't apologize for it, so that made them even more upset. And then the tide started to turn on that when a Buddhist monk walked out into the main square and covered himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire in front of all the news media. So the newspapers around the world had the photo of this old man covered in flames, grimacing on fire.
Yeah.
It was really,
It's on a
I can still see
album
it today.
cover of Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah. So that got the world's attention. And it was just showing you how things were going downhill. Remember, at this point, we were involved in Vietnam. People were saying, well, why are we involved? But we weren't really sending huge numbers of people over who were getting killed. So the Americans weren't paying that close attention. Again, it's post-Kennedy assassination. So we're focused on other things. So Johnson gets in, and he escalates the war. And why, I don't know. I guess he thought he had to look powerful. But by 1965, there were 175,000 American citizens in Vietnam. Governmental, non-governmental, advisors, supposedly not troops. We really started fighting the war for the French at that time. Okay, 65, I said 175,000 people. 66, 385,000 people.
Jesus.
So pouring huge numbers
Yeah.
of people in there. Now, this is the point I think that it could have been settled if people were really looking closely at it. It would be like, how is this going to end?
That's what my question. What was the goal? What were they trying to achieve?
There was no goal. It was a political stability goal. Nobody wanted to address that there was really a problem. They wanted to hide that this was a problem. Johnson was afraid that if he told the American people that up until 1966, it really wasn't working out and we have to go home, he didn't want to be the president who did that. Especially after World War II, it was only 20 years before, and we were the
Just
winners.
To save face and
yeah,
avoid looking weak.
And remember, it was mostly the Democrats that were in power since 1960. And so you're also thinking in terms of the national election, are they going to take it out on all the Democrats?
Yeah.
So they sent over a false message. They knew from studies that were done that they couldn't win the war unless they put over like 500,000 troops. And even then you'd have to have a standing army there to try and keep control in the country. There was just no way to win this war. But they didn't want to tell the people that. And this is the biggest problem we had, is that the people in government did not want that message getting out.
See, and that type of hubris, especially at those levels, is so dangerous. You know, they want to save face. They want to be perceived a certain way. And so in order to accomplish that, we got to send our sons and daughters, brothers, sisters into a meat grinder
Right.
of something that didn't even have a clearly defined outcome or ideal outcome in mind.
Right. Well, you know, the Creedence Clearwater Revival song, right? Fortunate Son. I'm not a senator's son. Well, if you were wealthy and your child wanted to go to college, that was an exemption. You didn't have to go fight the war. So we had more poor people fighting than anybody else. You could sign up with the National Guard. You could volunteer there, and you probably wouldn't go to Vietnam. There were strategies that people used. But the people who didn't have strategies, they were the ones who got sent. And
Damn shame.
yeah, it was incredible. Not only that, it was very expensive. And this is what people forget about America today, is we're stretching our arms all over the place, but we don't have unlimited money. And, you know, there's a reason why there's inflation. It means the government's spending more money than it has, and the dollar becomes worse because they just print dollars, you know. And that's that between COVID and giving money away around the world,
Yeah.
you end up with, you know, a 20% reduction in the value of the dollar, which is really a hidden tax on the workers.
You know what's crazy about this is if you completely remove the context from this conversation, you wouldn't know if you were talking about the 1960s or the 2020s.
Yeah, we're doing it again. There's no question. This is like a Vietnam situation. It's a little bit different because the Vietnamese, at that time, we didn't have as many Asian citizens. The Vietnamese were a different race from most of the people. Now you have the Ukraine, where there's a lot of Ukrainians in the United States, and they look like the white people in the United States. And that's part of the appeal of the Ukraine. It's an emotional appeal to many Americans. But it's the same issue. I love the Ukrainian friends I have. I have no problem with that. But the reality is that it is like a Vietnam situation. You have to have a goal that you're going towards. You can't just say, here, we'll give you more money, we'll give you more money. In fact, that's been going on for a couple of years, and you see where it's taken us. Yeah. Nowhere. We're right where we were.
Well, and I think savvy folks that students of history and whatnot, at least I hope, even recognize this in the beginning, that, you know, this was going to be a meat grinder with no, you know, real desirable outcome other than a bunch of folks got killed. And I don't know. It's,
yeah. Well, I mean,
it's a mess.
We have a tendency to do that. When we went into Afghanistan to get the terrorists out of there who had bombed 9/11, yeah. It should have been a limited engagement and get out. And we see that now. And then the way we got out was ridiculous. It was, you know, very poorly handled.
Extremely poorly handled.
And we sent the message that we were going to basically try and do regime change in there in Iran or Iraq. And regime change doesn't work. You have to. Democracy depends on the people wanting it. And these people they're not in a mindset like we were in America when we wrote our Constitution. You have to have the people really want that form of government.
And that whole, you know, having fought through all that, like, it's frustrating now, like, seeing elements of the truth coming out, like, what actually happened on 9/11. Was it what the government said? You know, I think a lot of credible sources point to there's a lot of missing information here, especially when you look at some of the footage of the towers. You know, Iraq. A lot of things that were completely unnecessary, and a ton of folks died on both sides. You know, not just our people, but the people that are from those. Like, you have entire generations of folks that have known nothing but war because of the choices of a few politicians and money. And it's, you know, it's frustrating. It's almost like I don't know, I guess this is nothing new in history. It's just a different...
The more I read history, the more
form.
I see that there are a lot of bad people who do a lot of bad things, and there are a lot of wonderful people who do great things, and it's a constant battle to try and get stability and quality of life, and to see the long game, not the short game. That's the problem.
Do you think, so this has happened so much, like so far, just in our conversations, we've talked about the American Revolution, which, you know, from all lenses that I can see it, you know, seemed like a pretty just thing considering what was going on. But we've got the American Revolution, there was a Civil War, a Korean War, War of 1812, Vietnam, the global war on terror. It's almost like a phenomenon of the human condition where things break down and we enter a cycle of war over and over and over again. And it's almost, you know, every generation, it almost seems like a test for humanity. Like, hey, have you learned this lesson? If you haven't learned it, the simulation's going to have to keep going through this in a different iteration until you finally get the message, like, hey, what do we want for our future?
Well, there's two things going on. There's always going to be conflict. Everybody wants everything. I was just as a quick aside, I read this, I didn't know this before, but when the United States took California from Mexico, another one of our, American conquests, right? Yeah. They actually got a reasonable guy, I forget his name. He sort of stopped the war and he drew a line through the desert so that he wasn't trying to have the United States take over something that was like in the middle of Mexico City or something where you would have a very hard time establishing a border. So he drew the border out in the desert where nobody was. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why the border held. But 2 years later, gold was discovered in the area in California that we took away from the Mexicans. It was only 2 years after. And of course, once the gold was out there, then there was a huge rush of settlers and so forth.
Yeah.
But that's how much chance there is involved in these things. And also, it's a good demonstration of how important it is to have land with resources. And this is what people want. They want land with resources. And capitalism, our system is we want to trade with everybody. We want to have world trade. That's going on now with, trying to get the tariffs in order and trying to get relationships with other countries in order, because trade is what builds the world. It also builds peace.
Yeah.
Trade is good.
I think, I was reading a book that, I forget the name of it, but it was written by Donald Trump and Robert Kiyosaki. And it was like a wealth type of book. But in there, in one of the chapters, Trump mentions, people's personal wealth. And one of the things he talks about, this is way before, this was written way before his aspirations, political aspirations. But in there, he talks about how he believes that everybody should have the opportunity to build wealth because it's a national security issue. When folks are poor and they're suffering, they start looking for alternatives to, what's being presented to them. And so it's interesting that you bring that up and, the whole trade thing, because I kind of see that playing out in some of his policy now and wanting to, push more money back to the people. I don't know. It's just...
The historians Ariel and Will Durant believe that that's the main reason that most civilizations fell, was that the people in power got so much power that they could just keep enriching themselves and didn't worry about the people, the common people, and they would get disconnected, and then they would lose their power. They'd be overthrown or whatever. It's common reason for people who are in power today. You've got to take care of your people. If you don't take care of your people, you risk loss of your whole country, and that means all the people.
Yeah.
It just doesn't mean your friends.
Well, and I was thinking that when earlier in this conversation you were talking about what Vietnam was going through with the French, like people were poor, they were suffering. The French were obviously there, enriching French lives and treating the native population like second-class citizens. So, applying that metric, they start looking for alternatives, and that's where something like communism seeps in, because communism directly addresses that sentiment. And
well, this is a good segue into this. After the partition, the communists in North Vietnam kept a secret army, underground terrorism in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong. That's who we all heard the name Viet Cong. But basically, they were run out of the North, but it was unofficial. Again, it was all behind the scenes. The North didn't admit this was going on. But how they ended up increasing the pressure was they would go out in the countryside, and if there was a supporter of DM or whoever the next leader was, they would assassinate them, take their land, and divide the land up and give it to the local peasants. And so the local peasants are like, hey, this is great. If this is communism, I mean, I didn't have anything before, and now they're giving me a 20-acre farm or something.
yeah,
And so the Viet Cong went after everybody in the sticks, out in the sticks. And if you were the mayor out in the sticks, you had a great risk of being assassinated because they were coming for you. So what did you do? You left and you went to the city. You went to Saigon or one of the other bigger cities. So you abandoned your land. The communists took your land, divided it up among the local people, and the local people are thinking, hey, this is pretty good. This is good. And that's how they started the push to drive the capitalists out of South Vietnam. So it wasn't very nice. They're just assassinating anybody who isn't with them. But the whole idea is, well, if we do all this, we'll have all the land and it'll be wonderful for our people. And when they finally got the capitalists out of Vietnam, it wasn't wonderful for their people. I mean, that's the punchline. We'll get there later.
yeah.
But that's how they did it. So
I mean, you saw that play out in China too, with the Cultural Revolution, other places.
Exactly, and we think of loss of life today. You know, Vietnam, we lost about 75,000 people altogether, I think. But you realize that China's revolution was somewhere around 25 to 50 million people, maybe more. You know, and huge numbers. Russia lost 20 million in World War II.
25 to 50 million. That's...
Yeah, and the world population when I was a kid was 4.5 billion people. Now it's 8 billion people. We could lose 1 billion people in a big war. Now, can you imagine that? That's possible. So it's
scary to think about.
It's even a greater reason to try and get people to work together and say, look, we got to take care of each other. We've got to make deals with each other. We've got to try to preserve stability. And we got to stop with what I call the clandestine or the hidden people from all the different sides trying to disrupt. I mean, that's what we had yesterday with the assassination yesterday. It was an attempt at disruption.
And I think that's what, you had a lot of really terrible, visceral type, horrific murders just in the past couple of weeks. The woman that was killed and thrown off a bridge. There was the woman that was stabbed on the bus in Charlotte. And then, the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
Violence becomes more of an option. And I feel bad about the extent to which if you look at what's streaming on the web, everything is violent. People it's exciting to see violent shows. Yeah. But you always worry.
There's a weird fascination.
Yeah, and I have it too. I admit to it. I never really liked gory stuff, but gory stuff is out there now so much, and the special effects are so accurate that I think people just get hardened to it. And I remember seeing the movie Bonnie and Clyde when I was, 14 years old or something like that, which showed them being gunned down at the end in slow motion with bullet holes appearing all over them. And I was appalled. I'd never seen anything like that. That was horrific. And now you can see it on 10 channels at the same time today. But I wonder what the effect is on people. And in other words, does it become more acceptable if somebody gets this weird idea in his head? Does it become more acceptable to kill somebody violently? And it's somehow like he's watching on TV or something like that.
I think when it obviously depends on the person, but it's kind of a soul contract. There's those that it doesn't matter how many times you kill, your soul hurts from that just because of, you're extinguishing another life. But it's funny you bring this up with violence because, training at the National Training Center out in Fort Irwin, there's a period of time where the Army brought in a lot of special effects folks and Hollywood guys to really beef up the training there and make it a little more realistic to what they'd experienced downrange. They did such a good job. They were employing amputees, amputated veterans and stuff, and dressing up their amputations with moulage to make it look like their legs got blown off. Wow. And they did such a good job that we often joked about how soldiers were going to get PTSD from training because it was so realistic.
I'm sorry to laugh, but it makes sense.
But I mean, it's very sense. It is so realistic. The training was that sometimes, if you didn't create a conscious separation between what you were doing, you wouldn't really consciously or subconsciously wouldn't really know the difference between what was real and what was.
Wow. Well, this is a good segue. So Johnson started bombing North Vietnam, right? And we almost never stopped for a long time. And we were telling the American people, this is good, we're winning, it's all going well, And meanwhile, we're spending so much money to drop these bombs. Of course, the military-industrial complex is making money from the government on this.
And, it was Afghanistan.
Yeah, but the scale was just so far beyond what was required. And then the effect on the North Vietnamese was the ones who survived, and most people didn't die in the bombing. It's a real terror-causing thing. They felt stronger because they had lived through it. What are we scared of these people for? So a guy might be sitting there and 10 yards over is a 20 foot deep crater from a bomb. that probably impaired his hearing for life, but he's there. He's alive. You think he's going to, this is his home country. Do you think he's going to stop fighting? It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question for the audience is, like, what would you do if, you were in that role?
Yeah.
Like, you can't really blame folks for reacting the way they do to something like that.
Exactly. So what happened was the communists gradually increased their power. More of the young people were going to communists. And then you run into a problem, you run into any war where you can't identify who's a communist and who's not, and who's a capitalist and who's not. Now, the Americans are the targets because most of them don't have Asian features. So most of them, the communists know are capitalists, and they become targets.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you're an American soldier, you don't know if the person who you think is your friend is going to drop a bomb on you tomorrow or stick a knife in you or do whatever. You don't know. The net effect of it was ultimately the fighting forces for capitalism treated every Vietnamese person with suspicion and with disrespect because they were always afraid they were going to get killed. And the South had the same problem in the North in the Civil War. It was the same thing. You couldn't tell apart unless they told you, depending on what uniform you were wearing or whatever. So it becomes very hard for the American soldiers to fight. And there's no keeping score. Like you were talking about the number of bombings. Well, here in Vietnam, it became body counts. And the senior military people wanted to hear that we were killing more Vietnamese soldiers because the thought was if we killed enough of them, we'd win the war.
There it is again.
Yeah, if we kill enough of them. So what happens to the people who are out fighting? If anything, they're going to exaggerate. Because if they come back and say, oh, we only killed 2 Viet Cong today, Sarge, and it's going to be like, you sure you didn't kill 10?
Yeah, it's like, what are you doing? Are you even working?
Right, yeah, exactly. It's like the cops writing tickets. It's
exactly.
Like you've got a quota to make, and whether cops writing tickets, there's written records, but there's not really written records of the killing of soldiers on the other side.
And I think that's a dangerous lesson of not having a clearly defined outcome. Why are we even fighting? How do you measure effectiveness if you don't know what your end goal is? And you're just fighting a war of attrition just to kill people at that point. And so when your report becomes, well, we killed this many people today, we killed more people today than yesterday, like, great job, keep it up, we're winning. Like, are you winning?
It's insane. It really becomes insane. And the thing that pushed us out of the heavy fighting was in 1967 with the Tet Offensive. See, the Viet Cong had gotten strong enough, and the Americans had bombed enough that North Vietnam felt like, look, we can do whatever we want. And the guy who was running it was a guy named Le Duan. I talked to him about him in the book. He was kind of behind the scenes guy.
Yeah.
And he was a real hard-ass kind of guy. And he was like, look, we're going to attack them, and we know we're going to lose a lot of people, but this may stop their appetite for fighting. So they organized it all. They went to the South Vietnamese and they said, oh, we want to, on the Tet. Now, Tet is like the first day of spring. It's the biggest Vietnamese holiday. They go to the other side, the capitalists, and they say, we'd like to have a truce over Tet so all of us can enjoy the holiday. So the South Vietnamese, of course, South Vietnamese army is very much like us in the French and Indian War. It's like they're letting the Americans fight and they're standing behind them. And they may have to fight a little bit here and there, but they're trying to avoid the fighting. So if you offer them a truce for a week or whatever, 2 weeks, they're going to take it.
Yeah.
And so they took it. Everybody goes, oh, great, let's go home for the holidays. But it was, of course, a ruse.
It was a trap.
And so they ended up, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese soldiers ended up attacking at 100 different cities in South Vietnam. 100 different locales all at the same time. This is like a 9/11 style shock and awe thing that they had planned. And they knew that they weren't going to win. They knew that the Americans had superior, weaponry, machinery, that it was going to be a bloodbath, but they thought, we're going to do it anyway. So they also attacked Saigon, which is the biggest city, and they attacked the American embassy.
Do you think part of that calculus was that they, knowing how LBJ was and how he approached this, that the Americans would overreact to that? And
I think that Leiduan had figured out that the American public was losing their taste for the war, because by this time the stories were coming out of soldiers coming back. 66, 67 is when the protests really got going.
yeah,
So he would have been aware of that. And I think he believed that if the story that the American generals were telling, which is we're winning the war, I think he believed that if he could stop that story, that maybe the Americans would stop fighting. And he was right. That's exactly what happened.
yeah,
So they attacked the embassy, which, the evening news, we only had evening news a half hour or an hour at night. It wasn't the 24-hour news cycle we have today, but the
Yeah.
evening news, all of a sudden there was this black and white footage of our embassy in Saigon being attacked.
mm-hmm.
And it was a shock to everyone. Like, well, what does this mean? If we're winning the war, what does this mean? Now, again, I was 14 years old. I didn't know who to believe. And a lot of the people were saying, those war protesters, they're not patriotic, they're commie lovers.
Yeah, right.
So anybody who didn't support the war, you were anti-American. But nobody really understood just what a poor foundation the war had and how we had been lied to.
Yeah, and what was the point?
There was no point, but again, the people in power were trying to hide it and send a different message. But when Tet happened, it was all over the world newspapers, it was all over the TV, and there was no way to hide this.
Yeah,
And then immediately after, I believe, Westmoreland, who was the general who had been put in to escalate the war, he said, well, we need 500,000 more troops. That was his response. And Congress wouldn't do it. Congress was now hearing it from their people like, wait, this is a big mistake.
yeah.
This is a big mistake. So,
I remember the imagery of the evacuation of the embassy in Vietnam, that imagery being overlaid with the imagery of the evacuation of the embassy in Kabul. And, I don't know, man, the parallels just crazy.
Well, and we had all these people who were helping us in South Vietnam who were basically capitalist oriented, and we had informants and we had people. There was like 250 or 300,000 of them who we had records of helping the USA, and a lot of people came to the USA after this who were American supporters after the war ended or during that time. We were trying to help the people who helped us, but because the planning was so bad, they were negotiating us leaving Vietnam, and it took a long time. But eventually the North Vietnamese just said, we're just going to push them out. And before the Americans left Saigon, they failed to destroy the records that they had of the people who supported the Americans. And they left those records behind. So the North Vietnamese ended up assassinating unknown hundreds of thousands of people for being collaborators with the capitalists.
I respond to these things with so much, like, I don't know what the right word is. I don't know, is indignation the right word? Like, this happened. We should have learned this lesson, and then we did it again. Our government did it again. And it's
a big machine.
It's so frustrating.
This is one of the gripes that people have about government. I have it too. Is that government isn't set up like a private company, where a private company can fail. Private company, if you don't provide a good product or do a good service or whatever, you go out of business. You're done. You're toast. But the government is never going out of business. So people who get in government, you have a large number of people who are really hard workers and good. But ultimately, people are protecting their job and their pension, and they're not necessarily concerned with some other problem.
It's just part of the machine.
It's part of the machine. So I don't think anybody who should have said it said, hey, we've got to take care of these records. It was more like, I got to get out of here before they shoot me. Or there was delay in getting things done. You know how somebody will put a dictate down and they'll say, okay, in 2 weeks you're going to destroy all the records of all the South Vietnamese people who have supported us. Well, you can hand out the order, but it doesn't mean the people are going to do it.
Yeah.
who's watching the subordinates, what's the chain of command, and this is in an area where, if anything, the Americans are getting ready to leave, and everybody's focused on, well, where do I go from here? And there's nobody who's the advocate of the supporters. There are very few people who are the advocates of the supporters who can do anything about it.
Was this unprecedented? Like the way the U.S. handled Vietnam and the way all that was approached, even through the evacuation. Was this an unprecedented type of situation? Had this happened before?
I think for us, for the United States, we had very limited involvement in wars. You know, we got called into World War I after it was already going for like 5 years, and I think that again, we talked about the word hubris, this idea of pride, of pride without a foundation. Mm-hmm. This idea that, hey, we're the big dogs, we can do what we want. Overconfidence, it's a word that we talk about a lot, right? Overconfidence is a problem. And I think we were overconfident and got in over our up to our necks, and then getting out, we didn't know how to do it. But I don't think America had ever had a situation like this before. It's one of the reasons why Johnson wanted to cover it up. And Nixon to some extent did too. I mean, Nixon came in 68, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think the war ended until 75 officially.
Yeah.
And Nixon was still bombing people and doing things because the North Vietnamese wouldn't negotiate the way that he wanted to. That's one of his Christmas bombing, where he was sending over B-52s, and American crews were lost. And everybody knew the war was over, but it was all about punishing the North Vietnamese and trying to get them to agree to a better deal. Nixon actually was a very bright guy. He got around Vietnam in one way by making the deal with the Chinese. We had really had no contact with the Chinese at all. He got together and he started a trade deal with the Chinese. That's when all this started. Right now we look at goods manufactured in China, it's like vast majority of goods, but in 72 there was nothing. Yeah. But by by getting together with the Chinese then backed off of supporting Vietnam. So
because of trade.
So this was Nixon's way of like, well, it'll increase trade, but it'll also help us get out of Vietnam. So what bothers me is being willing to bomb the North Vietnamese people. I mean, you're dealing with the government, but do you have to kill all these people? We complain about Putin doing it now, but Nixon was doing it then. Yeah. These people had nothing to do with it. They're just peasants and grunt
just trying
soldiers.
To live their lives like everybody else.
Yeah, and you're dropping huge quantities of bombs, and you're losing American soldiers to fight something that can't be won. Now he was worried about, and again, I've never been president. I've never been at that level of power, but he was worried about, well, how will we be perceived around the world? Will we be perceived as weak? Will this cause us to lose political power in other parts of the world where people will think they can push us around? Mm-hmm. If they do, what else is going to start to fall apart? So again, I don't know what information the people at the top have, and I can understand it being a concern, but it's very hard for me to stomach the throwing away of lives, and that's why I think like negotiation at the right time is the important thing. And here, there was nothing we could really negotiate, but if we had gotten out of there in 1966, it would have been a blip. It would have been a nothing. And now it still stains. Yeah. It still stains America.
Well, and that's my question is like, that was their thought process in trying to preserve a legacy of how we would be viewed globally. It's been about, 50-something years now? Yeah. How do you think that's shaken out, like, historically?
You're only as good as you, we used to say this in lawyers and doing work for people, you're only good as your last case. Yeah. You can be good on 10 cases, and if the 11th case you lose, they can chuck you right out. And I'd say that's the same for government. Yeah. It's like, don't worry about your legacy. Worry about now. Yeah. Solve the problem now. Do the right thing to fix things. Whatever is required to do that, and do it in a humane way and in a way that's in accord with our Constitution. Mm-hmm. And that means people in other countries count. Economies of other countries count. And take that, try and make a deal that works for everybody. And that can be done. Yeah. But when you do these other things, it turns people off. For instance, after Johnson did all the bombing, he said, well, maybe, this is, I guess, late 67, he says, what if I build them a dam in North Vietnam? We'll give them $1 billion, and we'll build them a dam, and that'll really help the North. You know, they'll dam up the water, they can irrigate, how about if we give them $1 billion? And he actually had that offer made. And you know what they said? They said, screw you. It's just like, wait a minute, you just bombed us, you're doing all these unprincipled things, and now you're going to try and throw money at us? We want our freedom. Mm-hmm. We want to run our own country. Now, let's just get to the end of it. So we got nothing good out of it. Vietnam got nothing good out of it. Le Duan and his group took over. They collectivized all the farms. Remember now, the communists come in. It's very important to remember, communists take over everything. All property becomes the government. So they collectivize all the farms. And I was just listening to a very good book on comparative economies about capitalism and communism and other kinds of economies. It's really, really very good. The guy's name is Stewart who wrote it. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. Very, very interesting about how economies work. So you've got this communist group comes in, and they have a famine right away because they're trying to reorganize all the farming and nobody's growing anything. There's no capitalist motive. They start losing people. They end up fighting a war with China. They had a war with, I forget, another country. I forget which. They were not doing well. They were doing very badly in the first 20 years after the war. And eventually they made a deal with the Russians, and they basically became a Russian puppet for a while. Now, I think because of our deal with China, I think that's one of the reasons that Vietnam sort of became closer to us now, where we have tourism in Vietnam, we have trade with Vietnam, although there is some indication that a lot of the goods coming from Vietnam are actually Chinese goods, and they're sending it through Vietnam for more favored treatment. But wars get settled, and things return to trade or whatever. Can't we get there sooner? You know,
yeah,
and the communists were just as guilty there. They thought, oh, this is going to be great. Once we're in power, we know how to run things. We know how to make our people do well, and they didn't. They didn't know how to run it. I mean, that's the big plus of capitalism: is if you let people do on their own to make their own money, take care of their own people. Yeah. And this is what this economist was saying: is nobody has ever shown that any collectivized farming has ever worked. The farming that really works is private family farms. That's what the world runs on for food, and it's just the way it works. Now, you can argue all you want about philosophies, but that's the measured reality of how that has to work.
Well, when you have all those degrees of separation, you know, it's kind of like, why am I over here busting my ass when I'm getting a regular shipment of food anyway? And then it just starts deteriorating from there.
And you don't really have control. When people don't have control, they're not invested in it. That's why it's very important for people who listen to this, listeners, to understand, like, this is a place of opportunity.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to work hard and learn, and you've got more chance here than any other place in the world to do well. But you've got to seize that opportunity. And
There's no limit to what you can accomplish in this country, especially based on your own merits.
Right. So even though we may have governments that get out of touch and sway from one direction to another, sway from too much government control to too little government control, you know, and there can be too little government control. My big thing is that I think government is inherently selfish. Government takes care of government, and because of that, government should be the smallest it can be. That I don't believe government should take on any task that can be done better privately. Yeah. But there are some tasks that the government should do. Like, I think highways is the classic example. It's like, we don't think highways should be privatized. We like the idea, in America at least, that you can get in your car and go, and that's freedom. Anybody in this country who can afford the car and the gasoline can go anywhere and get there pretty quickly because of the federal government's highway system.
Oh yeah, you privatize it and suddenly every road's a toll road.
Well, and there be inconsistencies and stuff. That's where government works well. And I think things like utilities, we all complain about them, but it doesn't make sense to have 26 different power companies who can't coordinate and so forth. So, some things that are big like that, railroads, things like that. Although, God knows in New York, the railroads, the MTA and all this is all screwed up because it's basically run by the government. And the money that's being spent in New York is on the railroads, and their crazy system and stuff is just insane. But that's New York. New York's going to have to fix it on their own. It's not a. Although I think Trump is arguing that because it's part of the federal system that he can try and fix it. So we'll see if he has any luck with that. But yeah, what we need is keep the government as small as it needs to be. You need feedback, and you need to look at the lessons. You can't. You're foolish if you elect liars. Even if you say, "Well, he's my liar," so he's my liar. I'm going to be with him. No. And I don't like people who send easy emotional messages, whatever the easy emotional message is. I think the one that you and I both agree on is this message that somebody is a threat to democracy.
It's just an emotional play.
It's emotional play, but also it raises the question, well, if they're a threat to democracy, what are we going to do if they get elected? So no political party should be saying to the people that the other party's a threat to democracy. We are in a democracy. We don't have any threats to the democracy. We have a voting system, and we'll figure it out.
Exactly. The simple fact that other option is there is democracy in action.
It's democracy. So don't talk about people being threats to democracy. You can say they're a threat to capitalism. You can say they're a threat to individual freedom. I have no problem with that. And we're in a time where we're really headed towards 1984 with the extent of surveillance, with the electronics, with AI. And I'm very worried about the deep fake video thing, because if people see a video that shows something on TV that's a complete fabrication, but it looks like a real political event, what's the outcome of that? These are, and this gets back to the other thing I talked about before, is about change. Good leaders adapt to change. It's a changing world. Recognize it. Do what has to be done to adapt to that world. And throughout history, the leaders that have failed have been the ones that have refused to recognize change. That's the number one reason why leaders fail.
And I think the discussion around Vietnam is kind of an interesting one, because we have a very recent example that the lessons that came out of Vietnam could have been applied to wars that we've recently been in. Well, and even what's going on in Ukraine. And, it's questionable some of the decisions that were made to stay in these conflicts when you have the Vietnam experience. How are we not applying those lessons? And I don't know.
It's again emotional. It's not easy. We have a situation with the Ukraine where we do have the European Union, who seems to have gotten on board that they see Russia as a threat to their safety. In other words, if Ukraine falls, will Poland fall next, which is part of NATO? They're all of a sudden lining up to pay 5% of their economies towards defense when they were only paying 2% before. And we're the furthest away from the conflict, but we're right in it with them. So you have a pretty strong force on the West, but it has to be used correctly.
Yeah.
And I agree that you don't go there with weapons and military lightly. And you certainly don't want to be starting a war with Russia. The Europeans don't want to start a war with Russia, but at the same time, you can understand why the Europeans want to support the Ukraine. I think everybody knows that the best solution is that the Ukraine gives up some of its territory, but remains intact with security guarantees, and that the world stabilizes. That's what everybody should want. So hopefully we get there. But it's that being mindful, not getting caught up in emotion, recognizing that good ideas come from everywhere. I mean, this is the worst thing about the Charlie Kirk assassination, but again, he'll become sort of a martyr because he was all about free political discourse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what it's about. You should listen to everybody's ideas and pick the best ones. And I mean, sometimes you'll agree, sometimes you'll disagree.
Mm-hmm.
If you pick one idea and it turns out to be the wrong road, well, 2 years later, change it, or 4 years later, change it. But there should always be a constant reevaluation of what the good ideas are and what can happen to solve the problems. But getting on this emotional road that, what it is, somebody's bad, Putin's bad, so we have to give the Ukraine money.
Yeah.
That is not a strategy. That is not, you have to have a strategy behind what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the voters need to learn this. This is the whole goal of this book is to have more people read it so that they'll recognize, okay, these are good leaders, these are bad leaders. I'm gonna vote for the leaders who have the qualities that I admire. And I would say like Abraham Lincoln is always the example people use because he never lied to anybody. He worked hard for the goal that he wanted to get. He was smart about it. He was energetic. He had good people. And he always thought of the United States as a whole. And he always thought of the South as being our friends, our family. We just want to bring them back into the fold.
Yeah.
And that's how I want our leaders to think about the world. We want the world to embrace capitalism because look at what it's done for us in America. But we've got to sell it to them. We can't ram it down their throats.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing about where we're at now. It's actually interesting that Charlie Kirk's company was Turning Point USA because that whole incident, like you said, he was a big advocate for talking through, having civil disagreement, being able to talk about sensitive topics, even if you vehemently disagreed with one another, but being able to have that discourse without resorting to violence. And, and that's what he stood for, and he was killed for that. And it's almost like it echoes kind of what we went through in the 60s and 70s. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King, who was killed for basically exercising his freedom of speech and what he thought and those ideas. And, in the middle of that, you had multiple wars going on, just like today. This is another inflection point about what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want our children to live in? And if we can't speak freely about this, even if we don't agree, where is that going to lead to? And I think we already know the answer to that because we've seen it play out just less than 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And here we are again being tested. But, the conditions are slightly different. Back then, you didn't have as large of a media apparatus as you do now. Like, I don't know, I guess in some ways it's different, in some ways it's the same, because now you have a different problem. You're overloaded with information. Individuals have to be able to discern what's manipulation, what's fact, and those lines get so blurry. The challenges are very real, but I think, if you side with compassion and humanity, you can never go wrong there.
Right.
And it's
right. What you were saying kind of reminded me of this guy, Gavin DeBacher, who wrote a book called The Gift of Fear, which I recommend strongly. Because one of the things he writes about is the psychology of people who commit public assassinations. And oftentimes they're people who are just looking to be famous and they feel their life has been a waste, but if they do this thing, somehow, that gives them power or value. Everybody knows their name.
Yeah.
But that whole book is a very sensible book about appreciating the world and where the risks really are and where they aren't. And it's been out there for like 25 or 30 years. It's still a bestseller. It's a really good book for people to read because you can kind of see how violence and celebrity and the way the public is perceived, you can see how that is expanded. And we're in a world now where anybody can be famous in 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, anybody can be vulnerable.
Yeah.
So how do we protect ourselves? We've got to understand what's really going on out there. And I think that's a good book that has sensible things that people can do for themselves to be safer and to make better decisions. But also it gets into the psychology of why it's so difficult to stop things like assassinations. You can't always do it. It can, the guy who shot John Lennon, he was deranged. But you still have to put security in place to try and stop those incidents in advance. And here, I guess the big thing with Charlie Kirk was that it was so open and it had very little security that he had become a bigger target than he knew and that we knew, right? And so somebody just took him out for whatever reason. We really don't know the reasons yet. We may or may not find them.
Well, and his platform was getting bigger. Like, he was making an impact. And I think that threatened.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the discourse, too. The thing that's appealing is he's saying, not don't listen to the other side.
Yeah.
He's saying, like I am. He's saying, listen to the other side. I'll be glad to tell you why I think this way. Tell me why you think that way. Maybe you'll persuade me. And he was effective to make conservative arguments doing that. But that's how problems get solved. We won't get them solved by putting them in the dark or say, no, we can't talk about that. Like the leaders of the South, once they seceded, they did all their decision making in private. They didn't tell anybody what was going on, because if you weren't on board, you were obviously wrong. We don't want any ideas that are wrong ideas. We have the right ideas.
Yeah,
and they closed their mind. Dangerous. I mean, they destroyed their country completely because they didn't see that they were going down this wrong path. There was nobody to say, hey, our women are starving, our children are starving, our people are being killed. You're not doing anything about it. There was nobody in their government to say that, and until it really fell apart. And Jefferson Davis felt that he would rather die than give up slavery. Well, you're going to do that for everybody in the South? What are you? Who are you to make that decision, right? So here the same way. Everybody's got to talk. Everybody's got to pay attention to what other people are saying and then respect them and understand that a lot of times most of us aren't right on everything.
No.
A lot of times we're wrong on everything. It's just the way that people work. Listen and judge.
And I think this being professional mediator and what you do as an attorney, like folks have to give on both sides to reach an acceptable compromise. It never feels good for either side to give something up, because there's maybe a sense of ego or pride attached to some of those things, but you reach a solution, and then 5-10 years down the road, like, everything's fine. Like, these points that you're willing to die on before, that you had to give up to reach a compromise, ultimately, did they really matter that much in the whole scheme of things? Were they that important?
I'm reminded this. I remember when the Miranda warnings first came out. I was in junior high school or something, but it was a big political issue. Whoa, the Supreme Court says you have to warn people. They said if you don't do the right thing, they may get off even if they committed the crime. That was a big bone of contention. That was all over the news, and we had stuff in school where people were debating this and all that. You know what? It worked out fine. We just accept it now. And guess what? Everybody gets the Miranda warning now. And that's something that was court created, but it was a good idea, because it did stop police abuse. And not all the way. I mean, the police can still lie to you. I mean, I love the lie that they tell people they think they're suspected of murders. They said, we looked in the eyeballs of the guy who was dead, and the last image they saw is printed on their eyeballs, and it's your face. And they would go to people and say this, and a not too bright criminal goes, oh, okay, I did it, And so the fact that the police lied, that was okay. I mean, that's part of the problem with dealing with the police, and why you should always have an attorney present if you're talking with the police, and especially now after you've seen all the.
Well, if you did nothing wrong, then you should be able to talk to us. Yeah.
Well, also, and if you say something false to the police, that in itself is a crime. And that's why you really want to have representation if you're going to speak with the police, because you may not know you're saying something false, but they may say that you knew something and you said it was false.
Yeah,
And now
it
all of a
gets really
sudden,
sticky.
that's a felony, you know? So you have to be very cautious. The police want to solve their crimes. That's their job, and I love the police, believe me. They keep the order, the thin blue line between us and disorder. It's extremely important.
Oh, yeah,
But
very
at the same
important.
time, can they overreach? Yes. The individual police officers will admit to you that some of their colleagues overreach sometime and do things that aren't right. I always like there's a couple of movies, actually, I never mentioned either one of them. Errol Morris is a documentary filmmaker who made The Thin Blue Line, which was made, it had to be 40 years ago. And it's about a guy who's wrongfully accused of murder, but it's a fascinating movie if you ever get a chance to see that. And then on Vietnam, I had thought I would bring it up, but I'm glad I thought of it now. The Fog of War, he did a documentary of it, and it's very good because it talks about World War II as well. But there's lots of interviews with Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under Johnson. And he came out of GM. He was like the head of GM or something, and then Johnson drafted him to run the Defense Department. And he knew in 1966 that the war couldn't be won. He should have resigned at that time and said to Johnson, "Hey, it's an unwinnable war. I'm not going there." He didn't. He stayed on for 2 years. He let the lie continue, and he's seen as one of the big villains of the Vietnam War. So a good thing about watching that movie, The Fog of War, is you get to see Robert McNamara talk about the war and talk about World War II and how if we lost World War II, the American government ruling leaders would have all been considered war criminals themselves and would have been executed or put in jail for life. So it's well worth it to see that movie, The Fog of War.
Fog of War.
Yeah, if you get a chance to see that. That's for anybody who wants to know more about Vietnam. That's a very good thing to see the horse talking is coming from the horse's mouth. He was right in the middle of it.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, what are some points that you want to make sure the audience walks away with?
Well, certainly with the Vietnam War, the war has to have a goal. It has to have a plan, a strategy. Why are we doing what are we doing? It's not just throwing money. It's not just being reactive. I think we have to be very careful. We are the 400-pound gorilla out there. We have better weaponry than everybody else, thank God. Thank God our economy is so good that we can afford to have the weapons. If our economy tanks, we won't have the money for the weapons. But we don't want to use those weapons if we don't have to, and we want to use them effectively. Let me end with this about how Vietnam War affected us. We spent so much money in the Vietnam War that it devalued our dollar dramatically. I saw it at the time. Before let's say in 1966, you could buy a Cadillac for $6,000. And by 1976, it was like $25,000 or $30,000. And that's because of inflation. And the inflation just takes savings away from people who put money in the bank. All of a sudden, that money is worth less.
Yeah.
And it's an easy way for government to get out of debt. But they do it on the backs of the savers. And that's why when we got into the 70s and early 80s, people just started spending because you couldn't save money. The money was going to be worth less. When I got out of law school in 1980, the interest rates were like 13-15% to buy a house. I mean, it got crazy because there was so much inflation. So you can't spend money just like it's not money. You can't say the government has unlimited money. It doesn't. It has the money that comes from our economy and what it takes from us and what those dollars are worth. Now, before COVID, I don't think the price of gold was $1,800 or $1,900 an ounce. Well, COVID, we printed a lot of money. We've been printing some money to do this stuff with the Ukraine as well. And the price of gold now is $3,800. I mean,
I should have bought gold back then.
but that's the marker. The gold is worth what the gold is worth, but the dollar is getting worth less. But on the other hand, with improved manufacturing, improved economies and stuff, the inflation isn't as bad as it could be.
Yeah.
And now we have these systems that can provide all of us with terrific lives. People around the world, we have so many things that are manufactured so inexpensively. And the world is changing dramatically. So be glad for what we have but also understand that this is a very rapidly changing landscape. And God knows where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years. I don't know what the effect will be of driverless vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many truck drivers in this country. What are they going to do if that happens in the next 5 or 10 years? What's it going to do to cars? Are people just going to give up cars and you're just going to call the automated car to pick you up because it'll be a lot cheaper if it doesn't have a driver and it's all done by computers? It should be cheaper. So if I want to drive 300 miles, oh yeah, I'll get the automated car. It's cheaper than owning my own car, which sits in my driveway for 23 hours a day, and I have to pay insurance on it every year. Maybe it's going to be cheaper to have a driverless car. Well, what does this mean for our overall economy?
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Where are we going? Well, we have to have leaders who can help us along this pathway.
Yeah.
And not just be looking backwards, but be looking forward. What do we need to do to adapt in this changing world? And we need good people to do that.
And I think the change is going to become more and more rapid as time goes on, now that we live in a world with AI and AGI and
this is what I'm hearing too.
Mm-hmm.
And so you wonder, well, are we going to need a lot of the white collar workers? Are a lot of the white collar workers going to be obsolete because the machines can do those jobs? And what are we going to do for a living? How are we going to make money? How are we going to compete? These are big issues that are in the forefront now. So we shouldn't be wasting time fighting wars we could settle. We should get those settlements in place, and we should be looking at, okay, how is the world going to operate going forward?
Yeah.
And keep everybody alive and keep everybody fed and keep everybody happy where they are. So you don't have people who say, I'm starving, I'm going to go attack your country, or I need resources, I'm going to attack your country. No, let's have free trade. Everybody benefits from free trade.
Now, we've been talking a lot about things at the macro level and, how things could have been done differently or what decisions led to what outcome. But when you take stock of the lessons that can be learned from the conflicts like the American Revolution, Civil War, Vietnam, looking at it through the lens of what you do professionally, what advice do you have for people to apply lessons like this into their just daily lives?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Mike. I would say a lot of it is common sense, but one is don't pick unnecessary fights. You don't have to. One is talk to other people and get other people's opinions, especially if you're going to pick an unnecessary fight. There are a lot of different ways to do things, and you want to pick the way that gets you the result you want in a way that preserves your relationship with other people, your relationship with your employer, your relationship with your family, everything. You want to think of your life in terms of, how do I make the best choices? And that means talking to other people, doing research, learning, and you will find your way through. And there's going to be good people and there's going to be bad people. You're going to have to learn to identify the bad people and get them out of your life if you can, and to support the good people who you feel are supporting you. Maintain those close friendships. Definitely, as a voter, again, I really don't like it when politicians try and give simple answers, try and give emotional answers, like, let's solve the problem. Mm-hmm. They should be talking that way. How do we solve this problem? You have to recognize there's a problem. And I think the reasons the Democrats lost, if you want to pick one reason, it was they said there was no problem with the southern border. And there's no problem here. Right? Mayorkas got up there. There's no problem. There's nothing happening. It's all okay. And I think the majority of the American people recognize that you just can't have open borders where people are coming in and taking your resources and committing crimes. Not all of them, just a few of them. But when you got 12 million people come in, that's maybe 100,000 are criminals. Okay, 100,000 criminals can create a lot of problems.
It compounds fast.
Right. So you got to vote for people who are willing to recognize reality and not try and send messages out that the government is infinitely large, the government can do infinitely everything for you, vote for me and there'll be something for you. The other side are bad people with evil intent. Very few people are bad with evil intent.
Yeah.
They just have their own ideas about how they want to do things.
Exactly.
Show them respect. Show your own people respect. If everybody shows everybody respect, we can do a lot. But so if you're voting, avoid the people who try and keep it too simple, who try and win by attacking the other side. There's no need to attack the other side. The need is to recognize the problems and fix them, whatever the problems are. Doesn't matter.
That's great. And where can people find your book?
Oh, on Amazon, they can, find it. It's supposed to be available everywhere, but I always find Amazon's the easiest place to start if they're interested in reading it. Again, I can strongly recommend it to people who want to know more of the details. I'm giving a very broad brush here, but it's quite suspenseful if you go through it. They're all essentially in chronological order, so it builds like a story. I'd love to see somebody turn it into a Netflix series that somehow brings some of these details in better focus so that people get some idea of the suspense of the story.
Yeah.
Because all of these wars are very suspenseful. But, and I think the book would be a good place to go for somebody who wants to do something like that, like a documentary on why wars weren't settled. And I'd love to see, I'm not going to do it, but I'd love to see somebody else take up that mantle with other wars, like World War II.
We know some filmmakers.
Yeah, exactly. You may know someone, but I do think that if you read just take any one war and you read about it. I think the Revolutionary War is the most interesting one because you're starting with almost nothing and you get to this situation that could have been avoided.
Yeah.
So it's like watching a movie where you know that the accident is going to happen, but you're watching it happen. You can't turn away as you see all the details.
Oh yeah, I mean, when we read the book, it was fascinating. There's a lot of things that you don't learn in school. Didn't even realize that that's the way it went down. And I guess we'll end this with came across a quote today, and it was stopping wars starts with knowing how they begin. And I think you do a really excellent job of laying out how those times got to that place and pointing out what could have been avoided. And
the motives of people and the choices that people made as they went along. And there are always voices present at those times that nobody's listening to, it turns out they had the right answers. But people ignore it. What do they know?
yeah,
So I think that's what people will get out of it. And the best thing I got out of it was somebody saying is I kept reading it and I kept on seeing today in it. But I don't mention anything about today when I'm telling the stories of the wars, really very little. But they found the similarities just by hearing the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the best part of the book.
Absolutely. Well, Bob, thank you very much for coming in. For those of you listening, please check out part 1 and 2 of this discussion series where we talked through Bob's book, How to Stop Wars and Save the World. Very fascinating examination of, these 3 wars and how we got to where we are and the parallels that are present even today. So thank you. And
Great.
yeah.
Thanks, Mike.